It began with a scream, faint, broken, and soaked in disbelief. In a small Oklahoma town where nights were usually filled with the hum of crickets and the soft glow of porch lights, something else pierced the quiet that night. The voice of a girl, trembling, crying out words that no one who heard them would ever forget. "You stabbed me." It wasn't a line from a movie or a misunderstanding between family members. It was real, raw, desperate, echoing through the walls of a house that until then had been a picture of normalcy. Inside that home, blood was already beginning to dry on the hardwood floor. A man stood frozen, his chest heaving, a kitchen knife hanging loosely from his hand. Around him, silence had taken over where chaos once roared. The air was heavy, the kind of silence that follows only after something irreversible has happened. And lying a few feet away, the figure of a young girl, his daughter, her voice fading, her eyes wide with confusion. To anyone who saw that moment, it might have looked like madness. But to those who would come to learn the story later, it was far darker than that. Because what led to that night wasn't a sudden explosion of rage, but a long brewing storm, one built from lies, fear, and the crumbling grip of a man whose mind had started to fracture long before the knife ever did. When police arrived, they found a scene that seasoned officers struggled to describe. 3 bodies, 2 already lifeless, 1 barely clinging to consciousness. The living room was a battlefield, overturned furniture, shattered glass, and the faint smell of gunpowder mixed with iron. The man at the center of it all didn't resist. He simply stood there, his eyes blank, as if the world around him had vanished. The officers didn't know then that this quiet, blank-faced man, a father, a husband, would soon become the center of one of the most chilling trials the state had ever seen. A trial where the only surviving witness was his own daughter, the same girl who had looked into his eyes as she whispered those haunting words, "You stabbed me." In the weeks that followed, the story spread like wildfire. Neighbors spoke of how the family always seemed normal, a hard-working father, a quiet wife, 2 kids who went to church every Sunday. There were no police reports, no visible signs of violence, just smiles on the outside and something festering beneath. But behind those smiles, the truth was something darker. The man, once a respected mechanic, had begun to unravel months before the killings. Those closest to him described sleepless nights, muttered arguments with voices that weren't there, and an obsession with the idea that someone, or something, was trying to tear his family apart. His wife, Lisa, tried to help. She suggested counseling, church groups, even called a doctor once. But pride kept him from accepting it. On the night of the murders, something inside him finally broke. He would later tell investigators that the devil was in the house, that he could see it in their eyes, in his wife's, in his son's, even in his daughter's. He claimed he didn't remember what happened next, only flashes, the sound of screaming, the feel of a knife in his hand. Then silence. His daughter Emma survived only because she played dead. She lay motionless, the pain radiating from her side, her blood pooling beneath her, pretending that her life had already slipped away. She could hear her father breathing, pacing, muttering under his breath. Minutes felt like hours. And when he finally walked out the door, she dragged herself toward the phone. Her trembling fingers dialed 911. Her voice was barely more than a whisper. "My dad, he stabbed me. He killed Mom and Jacob, please. Hurry!" When the dispatcher played back that recording later, courtroom reporters said you could hear death in her voice, not just the pain of her wounds, but the shattering of her trust. The sound of a child realizing that the person who was supposed to protect her was the one who had destroyed everything. At the hospital, Emma spent days in critical care. Surgeons said it was a miracle she survived. Her recovery wasn't just physical, it was psychological. She woke from surgery to find detectives waiting. They had questions. She didn't want to answer at first. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, blank, unrecognizing. The father she once loved was gone, replaced by a stranger with blood on his hands. By the time the case went to trial, the world had already chosen sides. Some saw the man as a monster, a father who butchered his family. Others, influenced by his lawyers, painted him as a broken man battling mental illness. But one thing was clear. When Emma took the stand, everything changed. She was no longer the scared, trembling child from that night. She had grown, scarred, yes, but strong enough to face the man who had taken everything from her. As she walked into the courtroom, all eyes turned to her. She moved slowly, her step steady, her gaze unflinching. When the prosecutor asked her what happened that night, she didn't cry. She didn't falter. Her voice was soft, but her words cut through the silence like a blade. "He stabbed me," she said, pointing at the man sitting just a few feet away, her father. The jury watched as he stared back at her, expressionless. For the first time, the truth wasn't just evidence. It had a face. It had a voice. And that voice belonged to the girl who refused to die. The courtroom air was thick with tension, the kind that clings to skin and sits heavy in the chest. As Emma's voice faded, you could almost hear hearts breaking across the room. The girl who once ran barefoot through her backyard was now facing her father, not in their living room, but under the cold fluorescent lights of a courtroom where truth was currency and every word carried the weight of life or death. Her father sat at the defense table, motionless. His face, pale and unreadable, betrayed nothing. But his eyes, hollow and distant, seemed to flicker for a brief second when she spoke those words. "You stabbed me." Some said he looked like he didn't understand. Others believed he did, that somewhere deep inside he remembered everything and was fighting to hide from it. The prosecutor, a woman named Karen Holt, walked slowly toward the jury. Her voice was calm but deliberate, carrying a quiet fury. "This isn't a case about self-defense," she said. "It's not about a moment of confusion or fear. This is about control, about a man who decided that if he couldn't keep his family, no one could." As she spoke, the jury's eyes shifted between her and the defendant. In front of them lay photographs, the kind no one forgets. The blood-stained floor, the overturned coffee table, the knife, and then a photo of Emma in the hospital, her skin pale, tubes running from her arms, her small hand resting limply on a white sheet. The image said what words couldn't. The defense, led by attorney Mark Redding, painted a different picture. To him, the man sitting beside him wasn't a monster. He was a victim of his own mind. "He loved his family," Redding said softly, "but love isn't always enough when your mind betrays you." What happened that night was not an act of evil. It was the tragic collapse of a broken man. The courtroom was divided. Some jurors avoided looking at the father altogether, as if eye contact might taint them. Others couldn't stop staring, searching for any sign of remorse. He never looked up. He never spoke. When Emma stepped down from the witness stand, she walked past him. The world seemed to stop for a second. She didn't look at him, but he turned slightly, his lips parting as if he wanted to say something, to apologize maybe, or to explain. But nothing came out. Silence swallowed his words before they could form. Outside the courthouse, the media stormed the steps. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. The words "family massacre," "triple homicide," and "survivor testimony" splashed across headlines. Strangers argued online, some sympathizing with the man's mental illness, others furious at the suggestion of leniency. But for Emma, it didn't matter what anyone said. Her truth had already been spoken. Back inside, more witnesses took the stand. A neighbor recalled hearing yelling and glass breaking before the screams. A police officer described the scene he walked into, a home drenched in blood and silence. The 911 dispatcher played the recording for the jury. When Emma's faint voice echoed through the speakers, even the judge's face hardened. "My dad, he stabbed me," she whispered on the recording, her breath ragged. "He killed Mom and Jacob." You could feel the weight of those words sink into everyone's bones. The jurors shifted in their seats, some wiping at their eyes. Even the defense attorney hesitated before continuing his cross-examination. Then came the medical examiner. Her tone was clinical, detached, but her words painted horror in sterile detail. Lisa Miller, the mother, had suffered multiple stab wounds. Jacob, the younger brother, had been shot once in the chest. And Emma, she had been stabbed twice. Once in the abdomen, once near the ribs. The second wound had missed her heart by less than an inch. If the knife had gone just a little deeper, the examiner said quietly, she wouldn't be here. The father sat unmoving. No reaction. Not when the photographs were shown, not when the wounds were described. He didn't flinch, didn't cry, didn't even shift in his seat. It was as if he'd left his body behind months ago, and only a shell remained. But behind that calm exterior, detectives knew there was something boiling. They'd read his journals, the pages filled with scrawled words about voices, shadows, and a belief that his family was conspiring against him. He wrote of demons hiding in his wife's eyes, of whispers in the walls, of a darkness that followed him everywhere. His defense psychiatrist would later claim that he was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. The prosecution called it convenient timing. In one entry, dated just a week before the murders, he had written, "If I can't save them, I'll have to free them." Those words, when read aloud in court, sent a chill through the room. The prosecutor paused, letting the silence linger, forcing everyone to feel it. Emma, sitting in the front row, stared down at her hands. She didn't need to look at her father to know what those words meant. By the end of the second week, the courtroom felt smaller. The air felt thinner. Everyone, the jurors, the attorneys, even the reporters, seemed weighed down by the horror they'd absorbed. The defense called one last witness, Dr. Helen Crow, a forensic psychologist. She described his long history of delusions, his refusal to take medication, his paranoia. She said he believed his family had been replaced by imposters, and that he was acting under the command of voices in his head. He truly thought he was saving them, she said softly. The prosecutor stood and looked her straight in the eye. "Doctor," she asked, "do the voices tell you to pick up a knife and stab your own daughter?" Dr. Crow hesitated. "No," she replied. Karen Holt turned to the jury. Because the only voice that mattered that night wasn't in his head. It was his daughter's, begging him to stop. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the man at the defense table finally looked up, his eyes meeting his daughter's for the briefest moment. And in that instant, whatever mask of madness or denial he wore seemed to crack. When the courtroom reconvened the next morning, the atmosphere was heavy, a blend of exhaustion, dread, and grim anticipation. The crowds outside had grown larger, their faces pressed against the metal barricades as if witnessing history unfold. Inside, the jurors filed back to their seats, their expressions hard to read. The defendant, Jacob Miller, entered wearing the same ill-fitting suit he'd worn since the first day of trial, his wrists faintly marked from handcuffs, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the courtroom walls, far away from the daughter who had survived him. The prosecution opened the day with evidence that would strip away the last fragments of doubt. Detective Zachary Holland, the man who had interrogated Jacob months earlier, took the stand. His voice was calm, deliberate, and unwavering, the tone of a man who had seen evil too many times to be easily shaken by it. He described the night of the murders, the scene that met him inside that quiet Miami home, and the long weeks that followed as he pieced together the truth hidden behind. Jacob's lies, he spoke of blood patterns that contradicted. The supposed home invasion, he described the financial records, the insurance policies Jacob had secretly taken out, each with double indemnity clauses for violent deaths. And then he spoke of the phone call, a single, ordinary phone call from a neighbor that likely saved Emma's life by interrupting her father before he could finish what he had started. When Holland mentioned the call's timestamp, 10:15 p.m., Jacob's eyes flickered, just for a moment, a subtle twitch, a tightening of the jaw. But to those watching closely, it was the first time he seemed truly aware that his plan had unraveled, not because of police brilliance, but because of coincidence. The jury watched the detective as he continued, now describing the digital evidence, Jacob's Google searches, His visits to public libraries, where he'd researched phrases like how to stage a home invasion, knife wounds fatal versus non-fatal, and how long before life insurance pays for murder. The words hung in the air like smoke, acrid and impossible to ignore. When the prosecutor projected screenshots of those searches on a large screen for the jury, several gasped audibly. The words glowed in stark white text against the dark courtroom. It was impossible to look away, impossible to pretend there was any misunderstanding. Jacob sat still, his face expressionless, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. But his knuckles were white. After hours of testimony, the defense declined to cross-examine the detective in depth, aware that every question risked reopening wounds the evidence had already made raw. Instead, they pivoted back to mental health, to the argument that Jacob had been unraveling, slipping into psychosis long before that night. Their psychiatrist returned to the stand, speaking about his fractured sense of reality, his obsessive gambling, his depression, and the hallucinations he claimed had haunted him. But the jury's faces told the story. They were listening but not convinced. By afternoon, the prosecution called their final witness, Emma's therapist, Dr. Sofia Martinez. Her presence brought a calm to the room that felt almost sacred after days of chaos. She spoke not as a scientist, but as a caretaker of a child who had survived the unimaginable. She described Emma's trauma, her nightmares, her fear of the dark, her lingering guilt for surviving. But she also spoke of her strength, how Emma had painted butterflies as symbols of her mother and brothers, how she was learning to live again in the quiet suburb where her grandparents now raised her. Then came the moment that broke everyone's composure. The prosecutor asked, Dr. Martinez, in your professional opinion, what has been the hardest part for Emma in her recovery? Dr. Martinez hesitated, her eyes softening. It's the question she keeps asking, she said. She wants to know if her father is sorry. A ripple of emotion swept through the courtroom. One juror pressed her lips together, holding back tears. Even the reporters stopped typing for a moment. Across the room, Jacob's expression faltered. For the first time in the entire trial, his composure cracked. He blinked rapidly, exhaled through his nose, and shifted in his chair. He didn't cry, but the silence that followed said everything about what he couldn't admit. As closing arguments approached, the prosecution prepared their final blow. Jacob's interrogation video. The lights dimmed slightly. The screen flickered. And there he was, Jacob Miller, sitting in a police interview room under fluorescent light, his arms crossed. His expression caught between confusion and arrogance. The jury watched as detectives calmly dismantled his story. They saw his reaction when confronted with photos of his blood-stained clothes. They heard him ask flatly about plea deals before showing a shred of remorse. And then they saw the moment that sealed his fate, when detectives played a recording of Emma's voice, weak and broken, saying, "You stabbed me!" The man on screen didn't break down. He didn't shout or deny it. Instead, a flicker of anger crossed his face. A split second of rage before he caught himself. That single frame was frozen on the screen for the jury to see. It was the face of a man caught between guilt and fury. Detective Holland's voice echoed in the courtroom from the video. That reaction told us everything we needed to know. When the video ended, the courtroom was utterly silent. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioning and the faint scratch of a pen from one juror taking a slow, deliberate note. By the time both sides rested, the case felt less like a trial and more like a reckoning. The prosecution had built their case brick by brick: motive, evidence, psychology, testimony. The defense had tried to pull at those bricks with desperation, but there was no foundation left to hold on to. The judge, stern but composed, instructed the jury before they were dismissed to deliberate. Her words were methodical and formal, but beneath them was an unspoken truth. This was about a man who had destroyed his own family for money and pride, and a child who had lived to tell the world. Outside, the crowd waited. Reporters refreshed feeds, cameras rolled, and the community that had followed every detail of the Emma Miller case held its collective breath. Inside the deliberation room, 12 strangers sat in silence for nearly an hour before the first words were spoken. The foreperson, a retired teacher, broke the quiet. "Does anyone believe he's innocent?" No one raised a hand. The verdict, though reached quickly, was carried out with solemn care. The jurors filed back into the courtroom late that evening, their expressions grave. Emma sat with her grandparents in the front row, clutching a small stuffed animal, one of the few things she had left from her old life, when the clerk read the words. Guilty on all counts. The sound was both triumphant and tragic. Jacob Miller didn't flinch. He didn't beg. He didn't speak. He simply stared ahead, his face unreadable, as if he'd already accepted that his story was over. The prosecutor exhaled quietly, her eyes flicking toward Emma, who sat motionless. A single tear rolled down her cheek. The courtroom erupted, reporters rushing for exits, murmurs filling the air. But for Emma, the noise faded into a distant blur. She wasn't listening to the chaos. She was listening to the silence that followed justice, the silence that finally felt like peace. When the verdict was read and the courtroom finally emptied, the air outside carried the weight of everything that had been said inside. Reporters shouted questions into the fading afternoon light, flashes from cameras igniting like tiny explosions against the courthouse steps. But inside one of the back corridors, the girl at the center of it all sat quietly, staring down at her hands. Emma Miller hadn't spoken since the verdict. She hadn't cried either. The truth was, there was nothing left to cry about. The prosecutor, Andrea Lopez, approached her gently. "You were very brave," she said softly, kneeling beside the girl's chair. Emma looked up, eyes swollen but steady, and gave a faint nod. "Does this mean it's over?" she asked. Andrea hesitated before answering. "It means he'll never hurt anyone again." That night, as the courthouse lights dimmed, Jacob Miller was led back to his holding cell, his wrists cuffed, the verdict papers tucked inside a manila folder on the deputy's desk. The echo of his footsteps filled the corridor, slow, even, resigned. No one spoke to him. No one looked at him. For the first time, the man who had once believed himself smarter than everyone else seemed painfully aware of how small he'd become. The penalty phase began a week later. The same jury was called back, this time to decide whether Jacob would spend the rest of his life behind bars or die by lethal injection. The courtroom, once overflowing with media and spectators, was quieter now, more intimate, more final. The prosecution began with photos, family portraits from years before the killings, smiling faces, summer picnics, a Christmas tree twinkling in the background. They showed the life Jacob had destroyed, not just with his knife, but with his greed and deceit. Andrea Lopez's voice trembled slightly as she addressed the jury. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a crime of calculation. He didn't lose control. He planned. He practiced. And then he went home and killed the people who loved him most. Then came the defense, clinging to their last argument, mental illness. They brought in another psychiatrist who spoke of delusions, of auditory hallucinations that may have whispered to Jacob in the dark. But by now those words fell flat. Even sympathy had its limits. When Jacob was given the chance to speak before sentencing, the courtroom fell silent. He stood, shackles clinking softly, and looked toward the jury. For a long moment he said nothing. His lips parted once, then closed again. The silence stretched, uncomfortable and heavy. Finally, he spoke, his voice hoarse, stripped of all confidence. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," he said. "I just wanted them to stop screaming. I lost myself that night." The prosecutor rose immediately. "And what about your daughter?" she asked, her voice steady but sharp. "She remembers every scream. She remembers every word. She remembers you stabbing her." Jacob's mouth trembled. His eyes darted toward the gallery, where Emma sat beside her grandmother. But she didn't look back. For the first time, he seemed to realize she wouldn't. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the foreperson's voice broke slightly as she read the sentence, "Death by lethal injection." Jacob lowered his head, a small, bitter smile crossing his face, a strange echo of pride, as if defiance was all he had left. The judge thanked the jury for their service, her tone formal but tinged with sadness. "This is not a moment of victory," she said. "It is a reminder of what we lose when love is replaced by rage." After the sentence was handed down, Emma's grandmother held her close. Reporters shouted from behind security barriers, asking how it felt, whether she believed justice had been served. But Emma didn't answer. She just whispered to her grandmother, "Can we go home now?" Months later, the case still lingered in the public consciousness. True crime documentaries dissected every detail. Podcasts speculated about motive and madness, and strangers on the internet argued about whether Jacob deserved death. But for those who had lived it, none of that mattered. Emma had started therapy full-time. Dr. Martinez said she painted often now, always the same thing. Blue butterflies flying away from a dark house. She says the butterflies are her brothers, the doctor explained during an interview. They finally got out. In one of her therapy sessions, Emma asked a question that caught Dr. Martinez off guard. "If he's gone, does that mean he's still my dad?" The doctor paused, unsure how to answer. "He'll always be your father," she said gently. "But that doesn't mean you have to carry what he did." The girl nodded, but her eyes stayed distant, watching a single butterfly sticker on the clinic wall flutter slightly in the air from the vent above. Meanwhile, Jacob Miller sat alone in a cell the size of a bathroom, 40 miles from the courthouse where his fate was sealed. Prison logs showed he spent most days reading the Bible and writing letters no one would ever receive. When guards asked who they were for, he said, "Emma." None were sent. Years passed. Appeals were filed and denied. Each denial brought less public attention, less outrage, less interest. The world moved on. But Emma didn't forget. On the anniversary of her mother's death, she visited a park near her school and left 3 painted stones beneath a tree, one for her mother, one for each of her brothers. The stones read only their initials, no dates, no words, no explanations. Just a quiet message that she had not forgotten them and that she was still here. When the date for Jacob's execution was finally set, no family members attended. The only person who came was Andrea Lopez, the prosecutor. She sat quietly, her expression unreadable, as the warden read the official statement. Jacob looked out from behind the glass, searching for a familiar face, but found none. As the injection began, his final words were barely audible. "Tell her I didn't mean to." No one answered. The clock ticked softly on the wall, and within minutes it was over. Outside, rain began to fall, light at first, then heavier, washing across the prison walls and streaking down the windows like tears no one wanted to claim. That night, Emma dreamt of butterflies again, hundreds of them, swirling in the wind, glowing faintly blue beneath the moonlight. When she woke, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not happiness, not sadness, something simpler, peace. In the months that followed Jacob Miller's execution, the story faded from the front pages, but not from memory. For a while, people still whispered about it, in coffee shops, online forums, true crime podcasts dissecting the psychology of a father who killed his family. But as all tragedies do, it slowly began to blur into the background noise of the world, leaving behind only the people who had lived through it. Emma Miller became a quiet name in court archives, a child survivor turned young woman whose story was too heavy for small talk and too painful for headlines. She lived with her grandparents in a house filled with framed photographs that time hadn't yet had the courage to dust away. The walls carried the scent of lavender and old paper, the sort of home that never stopped holding its breath. Afraid of breaking the fragile peace that had finally settled over it. At school, she was just Emma, quiet, polite, unassuming. Most of her classmates only knew fragments of what had happened. They'd seen the documentaries, heard the rumors, but no one dared ask her about the night that changed everything. It was as if her silence demanded respect. The teachers spoke softly around her. The counselors watched her progress with gentle eyes, and her therapist, Dr. Martinez, continued to see her every week. Dr. Martinez often said that healing doesn't come all at once. It comes in waves. Some days Emma laughed. Other days she woke up drenched in sweat, the memory of her father's voice echoing through her dreams. There were nights she would sit by her window for hours, tracing the scars on her wrist where the knife had once slipped, and wonder how she had lived when everyone else hadn't. But she didn't break. Not anymore. She painted every day, the same blue butterflies, always escaping the same dark house. Over time, the paintings changed. The house grew smaller, the butterflies brighter. On her 16th birthday, she sold one of her paintings for charity. The proceeds went to a local shelter for children of domestic abuse. When the check was mailed, she signed it with her full name for the first time, Emma Rose Miller. It was the same middle name her mother had carried. Meanwhile, the city itself was still trying to understand what had happened. The Miami Herald ran a retrospective on the case, The Father Who Killed for Greed. It analyzed everything, the insurance policies, the failed business, the lies Jacob told about imaginary debts. Commentators argued whether the death penalty had been justice or vengeance. But beyond all the words, what lingered most was the image of a little girl on the witness stand saying softly, "You stabbed me." That single line became something of a ghost, quoted, replayed, dissected endlessly by strangers who would never know what it cost her to say it. And yet to her it wasn't about revenge. It was about being heard. Judge Ramirez, who had presided over the case, gave a speech at a juvenile justice conference later that year. Her voice, usually cold and judicial, carried a rare tremor. "When I looked at that girl," she said, "I didn't see a victim. I saw the reason our system must never look away from children living in silence." The room applauded quietly, though many in the audience could see the shadow behind her eyes. Some cases stayed with you. This was one of them. The prosecutor, Andrea Lopez, went on to create a non-profit foundation in memory of Emma's mother, focusing on early intervention in domestic violence cases. She named it the Rose Initiative. The organization began small, one office, 2 volunteers, but grew quickly as others joined her mission. At the launch, Andrea spoke briefly about the case, her voice breaking only once. "I promised that little girl we would make sure no one else had to sit where she sat," she said. "I intend to keep that promise." As the years passed, Emma learned to live with the quiet. There were still anniversaries that hurt. April 3rd, her mother's birthday. November 10th, the day of the murders. But she marked them in her own way. She'd go to the beach at sunrise, stand barefoot in the sand, and let the tide wash over her ankles. She never brought flowers, just silence, just breath. There was one day, though, that stood apart from all the rest, the day she received a letter from the state correctional facility. It was dated months before her father's execution. The handwriting was uneven, the ink faded. Inside was a short note, only 3 sentences long. "Emma, I don't expect forgiveness. I only hope that one day you stop seeing my face when you close your eyes. I hope you dream of butterflies instead." She read it once, then again, and finally she placed it in a small wooden box, along with a photo of her mother and brothers. She didn't cry. She didn't forgive. She just closed the box and placed it at the back of her closet, a relic from a life she no longer lived. Time passed quietly. The world moved on. New cases took the headlines, new tragedies filled the airwaves, and the Miller family name slipped into history's long shadow. But for those who had been there, the detectives, the lawyers, the judge, it never truly went away. Every now and then, one of them would recall that trial, that haunting voice, that small girl in a courtroom full of strangers, saying the words that no child should ever have to say. And yet, life did what it always does, and it went on. Years later, when Emma turned 21, she stood at an art gallery in downtown Miami. Her first solo exhibition. The walls were lined with her work, dozens of canvases filled with shades of blue, gold, and white. The final painting in the collection was different. No butterflies this time, Just a sunrise over an empty horizon, light spilling across the canvas in quiet defiance of darkness. A reporter approached her that night, hesitant but curious. "Your work," he said, "it feels like freedom." Emma smiled faintly. "It is," she replied. He paused before asking softly, "Is it true that your father—" She interrupted gently, shaking her head. "That's not my story anymore." And for the first time, those words were true. Outside, the city lights shimmered across the bay, reflecting off the water like 1,000 tiny ghosts finally letting go. The girl who had once been a victim now stood as an artist, a survivor, a woman who had rebuilt her life from ashes. The past was still there, it always would be, but it no longer defined her. The night ended quietly, the way healing always does, not with applause but with peace. Years later, the echoes of that courtroom still lived in the quiet spaces between memories. Not loud anymore, not sharp, just faint whispers in the background of a life that had learned to keep moving. The story of Jacob Miller and his daughter had long since vanished from headlines, replaced by newer tragedies and louder scandals. But for those who had stood in that courtroom, it never really left. Some stories don't end when the credits roll. They linger, reshaping everyone who survived them. Emma was 25 when she returned to the house for the first time. The property had been vacant for years, its windows boarded, its yard swallowed by weeds and silence. The real estate agent met her at the curb, nervously adjusting his clipboard, unsure what to say to the woman who'd once been a child inside those walls. She told him she only wanted to look, not buy. And he nodded, understanding more than his words could carry. The door creaked when she pushed it open. Dust floated in the sunbeams like suspended ghosts. Every step felt heavier than the one before, as if the air itself remembered what had happened there. She paused at the base of the staircase, where it had all begun, where the shouting, the screams, and the breaking of everything that once was had filled the night. She stood there for a long time. Then she whispered, barely audible, "It's just a house now," and somehow, saying that made it true. She walked through each room slowly, her fingers brushing against the peeling wallpaper, her reflection flickering in cracked mirrors. In the kitchen, she found the same window where her mother used to stand, humming quietly while preparing dinner. For a moment, she could almost smell the cinnamon and vanilla that used to fill the air on weekends. It was faint, like a memory refusing to die. Upstairs, the rooms were smaller than she remembered. Childhood has a way of enlarging things, the good and the bad. She opened the door to her old bedroom. The wallpaper had faded to pale grey, but she could still see faint outlines where posters once hung. On the windowsill lay a single marble, half buried in dust. She picked it up, rolled it in her fingers, and smiled. The sound of distant traffic hummed outside. Life had gone on even here, even after everything. She turned to leave, but before closing the door, she whispered, "Goodbye." That night, she didn't dream of blood or screams or her father's voice. She dreamt of water, calm, endless water, and the sound of wings above it. The butterflies had finally flown somewhere new. The next morning, she drove to the courthouse, the same building where her childhood had ended and her adulthood had begun. The marble steps were worn smooth now, the plaque near the entrance glinting in the sun. She stood there quietly, watching strangers walk in and out, carrying their own stories, their own griefs, their own beginnings. She realized something then. Justice had never been about punishment. It was about acknowledgement. About saying, "I see you, I believe you, what happened was real." And that, more than any sentence or verdict, was what had saved her. A few years later, she graduated with a degree in psychology. Her final thesis was on childhood trauma and resilience. She didn't mention her father's name in the paper, not once. But her professor, reading through the final paragraph, felt the truth pulsing between every line. Emma went on to work at a crisis center for survivors of domestic abuse. She didn't talk much about her past, but when she did, it wasn't with bitterness. It was with the calm of someone who had seen the worst of the human heart and still chosen to believe in its ability to heal. Sometimes, She'd see other girls come into the center, silent, trembling, afraid of their own voices. And she'd sit with them, quietly. She wouldn't say much. Just a simple, steady, "You're safe now." One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she received a message from Dr. Martinez, now retired. The note was simple. "I saw your interview. I'm proud of you. The butterflies would be too." Emma smiled when she read it. She stepped outside, looking up at the fading orange sky. A light breeze passed, carrying a small white feather to her feet. She picked it up, tucked it in a notebook, and walked home. Home, a word she had once feared, a word she had thought would never belong to her again. But it did now. In the years that followed, the name Miller no longer meant tragedy. It meant art, it meant healing, it meant survival. Her exhibitions began touring across states, each painting carrying the same quiet defiance, not of revenge, but of endurance. One journalist wrote, "Her art doesn't scream, it breathes," and maybe that was what made it beautiful. The final piece she ever painted was small, just 12 inches across. A single butterfly, wings half open, resting on the edge of a broken window frame. At the bottom corner she signed her name. Not Emma Miller, just Emma. The world didn't need to know the rest. In interviews, when asked what message she wanted her work to carry, she always gave the same answer, that no matter how deep the wound, the heart still remembers how to beat. Years later, her painting would hang in a gallery near the courthouse, the same one where a scared little girl had once taken the stand and said, "You stabbed me." Now, that same girl's work stood in silence beneath the soft glow of gallery lights, telling a different story, one not about violence but survival, one not about fear but freedom. And as people walked past that painting, some paused. Some didn't, but for those who stopped long enough to look, they saw it, the faint outline of a child's shadow fading behind the butterfly's wings, as if she had finally let the light in. Outside, the night settled softly over the city, carrying with it the hum of life, buses, laughter, music, and 1,000 windows flickering with warmth. Somewhere within that hum, a single heartbeat echoed. Quiet but steady. It didn't belong to a victim anymore. It belonged to someone who had survived, forgiven the silence, and learned how to live again. And in that stillness, in that peace, the story finally ended.